So, Hutch Parker, I think one of the most surprising movies of 2017 was Logan. Not just because it was another good superhero movie, but because it was a really great movie in general. Why do you think this movie stood out from so many other superhero films?
I think for a couple of key reasons, and I think there was sort of a movement building to something like Logan. For us, Jim Mangold was critical. You know, we had made the Wolverine together. He and Hugh had worked together in the past. Jim is I think one of the best dramatic filmmakers working today. Um, I truly think he's an extraordinary filmmaker, and his instincts obviously came to us in the Wolverine was his introduction into the X-Men universe, to that character, and out of that experience came the instinct that there was further to go, with the character. And Hugh was eager and hungry to do more. I think Jim rightly had the instinct to drive it towards something much more dramatic, something unique in tone. Looked to model it as a Western. All of those things I think coalesced into what was, really an attempt to do something different, to be bold and shake it up a little bit. And I think, both for us that was the drive, but it also felt like that's what the audience was responding to. You could see the films that were breaking new ground, whether that was Guardians of the Galaxy, which obviously very different tone, but I thought was such a remarkable breath of fresh air, and sort of opened the door to taking new and fresh approaches to the tones of these stories. Jim, as you know from his body of work, is somebody who's done incredibly well with challenging dramatic material, with performance, getting the best out of his actors. And I think everything sort of grew out of that. It invited the more gritty, grounded, dirty character that we find for Charles. It invited the aging Logan, the dystopian sort of pseudo future that it represents. All of those things kind of came as a piece from that intention.
It's interesting because, I mean, as you mentioned, with the Western influence of it, both of these movies, Logan and the Wolverine, share characteristics with other genres of filmmaking. I mean, the Wolverine had a lot in common with samurai films. This one has a lot in common with the Western. Can you talk about infusing Logan with this kind of sensibility of the Western genre?
Yeah, I think honestly, it was as much a function of Jim identifying that the character of Logan is very much an iconic Western style character, and actually the Wolverine was as much, it owed some to the Japanese samurai film, it owed some to film noir. Similarly, iconic characters of that genre are loners, are ones who shy away from connection, are ones who are reluctant heroes drawn into, usually by a woman, into some complicated situation. So in both cases, I think it grew organically out of, well, what is this character? How does this character exist? And what is the most interesting way to explore the issues that are naturally embedded in him? I think the Western gave us the slightly tragic framework really neatly. It was one that lent itself, I think, pretty organically to what we knew we were going to do, because we knew we were going to kill him at the end. And so, in the engineering of the story, that just it really served us particularly well.
The film also goes a lot deeper into character than some movies of its ilk goes. I mean, you could really tell this story about an aging man with his father figure and surrogate daughter traveling across the country, running away from something. You could pretty much tell that story in just about any kind of genre of filmmaking, and the characters are all given these really interesting arcs. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I think, again, a lot of that is owing to Jim, and his sculpting of the screenplay, particularly with Scott Frank, and to Hugh. Hugh was pretty relentless in aspiring to do something different. And part of what that meant, and I think this is, true, is that for us, having worked on so many of the X-Men films and so many of the films within this world, there is something slightly theatrical and slightly less real about them traditionally. They were more action movies initially than they were, certainly not, you wouldn't have called them dramas. So part of embracing the idea of doing this as more of a drama meant going deeper into the character-based issues and actually making it, the story is driven by the character-based issues more so than it's driven by the action. The action sequences were designed to try to grow out of character dilemmas and choices rather than, have, which is sometimes the case, the feeling that you're going from action sequence to action sequence and there's some character bits in between. Even to the point of a meaningful reference point for us in developing the project was actually Paper Moon. So as odd as that sounds, it was a touchstone in terms of what is the tone and feel and texture that we want from this. And obviously ours is R-rated. A lot of people die, bloody. It's different in those regards, but the family architecture was not dissimilar. And the sort of odd couple pairing was not dissimilar. And the degree to which, our young character in Laura was unusually wise and soulful and imbued kind of the adult, not unlike the Paper Moon dynamic between the two of them. So it was all a function of how do we ensure that we can deliver on a film through character first and come, hopefully deliver on the action and the things that go along with the genre, but make it about character first. And that meant really committing to the character-based stories. As an example, to me, that the sequence with the farming family in the middle of the movie, pretty unusual sequence for these movies where you stop a fairly breathless, escape for a series of dramatic scenes around a dinner table, talking about family. That was a very unusual choice and yet a very conscious one on Jim's part, because he really wanted to load up the connection you felt for these people and load up the tension around that turn and where that story goes, make you care more. And I believe he was right that the time invested there, is part of what makes the impact so great.
Yeah, that scene is interesting in the way it's almost like a little short film contained within this entire, this greater narrative.
Yeah.
I like your Paper Moon comparison, by the way. I'm just imagining, I'm imagining the two of them like Ryan O'Neal and Tatum O'Neal in it. There is violence in the movie. I think one of its notable qualities is, first of all, it's R rating, so it is a lot grittier and bloody than some of these movies usually are. But it also it deals with violence, even though it's in a superhero action movie. It really deals with the consequences of violence in a very interesting way. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, and I actually love that you identified that. Yeah, because it was a very Jim is a self-proclaimed, slightly cynical, I'll say, about comic book movies in general, and and came at it with a critical eye for employing a lot of the techniques and devices and tropes of the comic book movie in a different way. And one of the things that you hit on so astutely that he really cared about was the movie must be violent, right? Both because that's the truth of this character, and to not be so is something that it's almost a little bit of a lie that we've been perpetrating over the many years. But also for Jim, it was critically important to have the violence and have consequence in order to make us feel the emotion and the sense of loss and the sense of vulnerability that's essential to the story. Had you made the same story without the violence and therefore without the potential threat, without that very real unease you get by what might happen, I don't think we would have gotten the same result. I don't think you'd feel the same catharsis at the end. I don't think you'd feel the same way about the experience. So, for us, but really most notably for Jim, it was a very conscious choice, not to try to be in any way indulgent, but to try to keep that sense of threat are alive because it informs the sense of vulnerability you feel for Charles, for Laura, and ultimately even for Logan, by the end. And it's interesting because both that sense of consequence and the level of intensity are things we hadn't been able to avail ourselves of in any of the movies to date. So it really gave us a new instrument to bring to bear on the story we're telling.
You've produced your fair share of comic book movies. When these movies are done well, what is the special appeal that they have? Why are they so successful with audiences?
I think I don't know that I think it's so mysterious. I think they're myths. They're a way of you're creating an archetype that on the one hand is a fantastic realization of humans, right? Of human beings, be that Wonder Woman, be it, pick your character. But at core, it's an exploration of their flaws and of our fallibilities. And, in the degree to which mutants are characters who are both shunned and sort of admired by some, you get that paradox. In Logan, I think, that mixture of humanity and the threat of the threat of rage is, I mean, frankly, in our times now, I think it's almost a perfect distillation of the psychic dynamics right now. But that commingling of those values, which is so perfectly realized in Hugh, right? It's hard to imagine now anybody else playing that role because of how well he communicates both of those extremes. But that process of trying to balance those values and the way in which the world navigates that, I think those are the kinds of things that make comic books so powerful. And why I tend to be drawn more to probably the more dramatic approaches to these stories, because I find the underlying conflicts, the underlying emotional dilemmas are so relatable. And I think that's what makes them both timeless and makes them so now universal.
And I think this movie also proves that when you get talented people like Jim Mangold and Hugh Jackman and Patrick Stewart and Scott Frank to do your movies, then you can elevate these movies to great art.
Yeah, you're not wrong. And, I'd add even Daphne, though she was a first timer. It was an extraordinary team. And that list, not only did it invite absolute top craftsmen from all over the industry, but every day, because you knew you were doing something risky and slightly scary and very, very exciting, it brings out the best in everybody. And that becomes an energy you feed on as a group, as a family. You're all kind of breathing that air and fighting for that what you think is possible.
Well, Hutch Parker, thank you so much. Congratulations on the movie. It's a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you. Thanks for taking the time.
You're welcome. Have a good one.
You too.